Hello. There is an ongoing problem in aviation. No matter how well trained and experienced pilots are, they continue to exhibit behaviour which is at odds with their training and with that experience, which is another way of saying they don't do what they're supposed to. Whilst there may be many reasons for this, I want to suggest that, more often than not, it results from a failure properly to manage their emotional reactions to situations. Now, whilst we don't need to be psychologists or neurologists, we need to understand, at a basic level, what goes on inside the brain. We will divide this up into three areas. This is the prefrontal area, or what we might call the input. This is where we gather data about the world around us through the media of our senses. That data goes for collation and storage into here. Many sections collectively called the neocortex, but I like to call it the human brain, where we human beings create and imagine. This gives human beings their unique evolutionary advantage. Unlike other animals which must solve problems through generations of trial and error, we can examine a situation, perceive the facts, and create or imagine a solution which may never have existed until that point in history. And when we do that, when we perceive the facts and reality of the situation and then create a solution and then act on that solution, we tend to get it right. So, what about the rest of the brain? Again, there are many complex interactive parts, but we can lump it all together and call it the chimp brain. The function of the chimp brain is to keep this animal body alive. It does this with a series of automatic responses, partly governing the basics of breathing, heart rate, and digestion, but it's also our stress responder. If my primitive animal self is placed in a stressful situation, say a tiger running towards me, I do not have time to assess the objective reality of the situation and create or imagine a solution because the tiger will have eaten me. I need something far more basic, quick, and automatic that simply says, "What? Teeth? Run!" And thus I survive. To do this, the chimp brain will, when placed under stress, generate an emotional response, some varied combination of anger, anxiety, or depression. Now these are the only three currencies in which the chimp brain trades. For cavemen, these are brilliant, as they provide powerful impulses for action. Either I will attack the threat, run away from the threat, or retire to the back of the cave and wait for the situation to change, and I will generally survive. But our modern world has been created using our intellectual, creative, human brains. In particular, there is nothing natural for humans about flying through the air miles above the surface of the earth at hundreds of miles an hour. So, when a problem occurs, whilst we are doing that, we need our human brains to solve it. Unfortunately, it is precisely under those circumstances that the chimp brain will respond, first, powerfully, and automatically. Such occasions when we act in response to anger, anxiety, or depression, when we ourselves would rather be acting in accordance with our human brains, is what the psychotherapists refer to as unhelpful behaviour. We neatly sum this up as, "What on earth was I thinking?" Take an example of a pilot who is flying an approach. His attention wavers for just a moment and the aircraft starts to drift below the required flight path. This mistake causes a small amount of stress. The automatic response of the chimp brain is emotional. Typically, he will become angry, usually at himself. Here's the problem. The chimp brain's function is survival. When in a heightened emotional state, it will therefore default to an assumption of the worst-case scenario. A practical upshot of this is that our ability to perceive reality is compromised. In this case, our pilot does not perceive the aircraft has deviated from the glide path. He perceives, "I'm getting this wrong." The effect of that perception is to increase the amount of stress he experiences and produce a further emotional reaction, this time of anxiety. It is a feedback process I like to call the Chimp Brain loop. Stress gives rise to emotion, emotion ultimately begets stress. And now, in this angry and anxious state, our pilot's perception is still not the reality, but instead the thought, I am failing. This triggers another trip around the chimp brain loop, producing more stress and a further emotional reaction. The resultant behaviour is anyone's guess, but it is likely to be unhelpful, because the chimp brain is so much more active than the human brain. And afterwards, he will say to himself, what on earth was I thinking? In a sense, he wasn't thinking. Another issue in the realm of human factors is the management of the startle reaction. One of the most dramatic examples is that of Air France 447, which crashed upon encountering an upset over the Atlantic on its way home from Rio, June 1st, 2009. At the exact moment of the upset, the primary flight display indicates a stall. The nose has dropped and the aircraft has rolled sharply to the left. The pilot of the aircraft desperately needed his human brain to come forth with the appreciation of that fact and the recall of the knowledge of what to do. That is, push forward on the stick. However, the effect of the upset, seeming to come from nowhere, was to produce a sudden injection of stress into the chimp brain and an acute burst of anxiety. This is the startle effect. The side stick position indicator shows us that rather than gently ease the nose of the aircraft down, the pilot instead pulled back on the stick. This, of course, had no effect, but his ability to perceive that reality was compromised. Instead, he perceived something like, this is all going wrong. This had the effect of increasing the stress and the anxiety, putting him in a state of shock. Unable to think of an alternative, he simply pulled harder on the side stick, still to no effect. Still, he could not perceive reality. What he perceived instead was, I've lost control of the aircraft. Maybe even the first inklings of the thought, we are all going to die. And with that, the chimp brain is utterly overwhelmed with stress and anxiety. Fear. For that pilot, in that moment, the chimp brain was the only active part of his brain. The act of pulling on the stick was archetypal unhelpful behaviour, not just a failure to do the right thing, but actively doing the wrong thing. And not just for a moment. He pulled the stick hard against the stops and held it there, whilst that aircraft fell 32,000 feet before impacting the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. If anyone ever dismisses feelings or emotions as unimportant or pathetic, they would do well to remember that just as much as mechanical failure or severe weather, they are powerful things which can bring down aircraft. If we are to manage these emotional reactions in order to avoid the resultant unhelpful behaviour, we can learn a lot, I think, from the realm of psychotherapy. Psychotherapists are called upon to treat conditions such as clinical depression or generalised anxiety disorder, where the chimp brain loop process has become so far advanced as to impair the patient's functioning. It would make sense, then, that the techniques can be applied to pilot training. What follows is a broad introduction to 3 psychotherapeutic techniques and how we might apply them to flight training, starting with mindfulness. Mindfulness has its roots in Buddhism, and its formal practice consists of a series of meditation exercises. Now, before people start to panic, I'm not about to begin preaching a state of spiritual well-being or oneness with the universe. Recall that our human brain functions best when it can perceive the facts of reality of a situation. So, if we can focus our awareness on the here and now rather than an imagined future, we are in the best place to create a solution. Moreover, whilst our emotional feedback responses are automatic and entirely natural, the chimp brain loop feedback process is one best avoided. It would be useful for pilots then to recognise what is going on in their minds and, crucially, to accept it as normal. These are techniques that can be learned through mindful practice, paying attention to the here and now, without judgment. What do I always have with me here and now? My body. Okay, then let's spend some time practicing paying attention to what is going on with my body. What can I feel? Not good or bad, but simply what physical sensations am I experiencing and where? And if my mind should wander off, even to the point of having an emotional reaction to that thinking, well, let's accept that. It's okay. It's normal. At some point in the future, a pilot will encounter something which startles them. This is an inevitability. But what if that pilot has developed the ability to recognise, I'm having an emotional reaction? That's okay. That's normal. But let's see if I can't just put it gently to one side and bring my awareness to where I want it to be, in the here and now. That mental act just gives his chimp brain a moment of pause, during which the stress and the anxiety abate for just long enough that the human brain can become active and do what it does best: assess the reality, create a solution. One of the other things that the chimp brain does is to remember stressful events. A particularly stressful memory imprints itself upon the chimp brain and, if triggered, will produce emotional responses as if the original event were happening again. We see this most apparently in victims of trauma. That same effect, though, is used in behavioural therapy. Certain situations that are easy for most can trigger powerful emotions, especially anxiety, in some. This will lead to the unhelpful behaviour of avoidance. A behavioural therapist will work with that person by exposing them to small amounts of those situations and gradually building up a tolerance. It's a form of inoculation. A small amount of stress, deliberately introduced, helps manage the larger stresses when they come. For pilots, the simulator is the ideal place to apply this. We can inoculate pilots with small, manageable amounts of stress. For this to be most effective, the trainee needs to be emotionally involved. That means, firstly, the scenario needs to be as realistic and relevant as possible, and secondly, that the trainee needs to be encouraged to imagine that they are really flying an aircraft. If we get this right, then should the pilot encounter a situation in real life, whilst it's unlikely they will have encountered that exact situation before, however, their emotional state should be somehow familiar. And familiarity with that emotional response makes it easier to accept it without acting in response to it, allowing the human brain to deal with the problem instead. Often going hand in hand with behavioural therapy is cognitive therapy. This relies for its effectiveness on the fact that how we feel about something is linked not to the thing itself, but to how we think about the thing. Or rather, what thought is offered up automatically by the chimp brain in response to the thing. From this follows one basic fact: there is no such thing as an emotional overreaction. The link between the activating event, A, and the emotional consequence, C, is the automatic subconscious thought or belief, B. These are tied together like one structure. There's no point in telling this person not to get emotional, because it is an inevitable consequence of the activating event. Remember our pilot getting angry on the approach. What's triggering that anger? In a calm and accepting environment, and bearing in mind that somewhere in his head that reaction is entirely appropriate, our line of inquiry might go something like this. You're frustrated about something. What? The aircraft got away from me. Okay, so what? It's not where I want it to be. Okay, so what? I should be able to do this. Now note, we're getting there, but this isn't quite enough to create that level of anger. Let's try one more. Okay, so what? I'm a bad pilot. Now that is clearly worth getting angry about. A slight mistake on the approach is enough to trigger the thought, I'm a bad pilot, leading to the emotional consequence of anger and the ensuing unhelpful behaviour. Now that we've uncovered the belief, we can go on to work out why he thinks that, what his evidence is, and try to challenge it. Without it, the emotional consequence is no longer inevitable. And with luck, the Chimp Brain loop process will never even get started. Flying aircraft is not just about technical knowledge and application of procedure. Pilots must possess a broad range of non-technical competencies. These are enhanced and rendered effective by proper management of emotions. Psychotherapists seek to modify the behaviour of those whose emotional state compromises their functioning in everyday life. Pilot instructors seek to modify the behaviour of those whose emotional state compromises their ability to fly aircraft. We need to recognise the importance of emotions. We need to equip pilots and pilot instructors with technique gleaned from psychotherapy to manage their emotional reactions. We need emotionally intelligent men and women on the flight deck and in the simulator to apply those techniques to their best advantage. Because, after all, whilst the modern airliner is a technical marvel, it is still flesh and blood, emotional animals that we place at the controls.